I used to believe a locked garage door meant something. Privacy. Ownership. The simple promise that what waited behind it belonged to me and no one else. I found out how wrong I was the morning my phone buzzed with a motion alert that should never have existed. The faint electric hum of my security app cut through the quiet while I was finishing a service call 15 miles from home. I glanced down expecting to see a delivery driver or maybe a neighbor chasing a loose trash can after another windy Texas morning. Instead, I watched my garage door rise exactly 12 inches before stopping, just enough for someone to duck underneath. Two people wearing bright blue HOA inspection jackets slipped inside without knocking, without calling, without a single ounce of hesitation, as though my property had somehow become theirs overnight. The smell of machine oil and fresh-cut cedar almost came back to me through memory alone because I knew every inch of that garage. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 39 years old, a mechanical engineer, and every evening after work I disappear into that garage to restore the 1968 Ford Mustang my father left me before cancer took him. Every wrench hangs exactly where I placed it. Every toolbox has its place. Every scratch on that concrete floor tells part of my family's story. Watching strangers walk through it felt like seeing someone stroll across a living room with muddy boots. One inspector swept a flashlight across the walls while the other lifted storage bins, opened cabinet doors, and snapped photographs faster than I could count. They weren't looking at exterior maintenance. They weren't checking paint colors. They were searching, deliberately, methodically. The woman leading them was Linda Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of our HOA inspections, a 54-year-old former real estate broker who treated neighborhood rules like federal law. Her white SUV had become so familiar around the subdivision that people closed their curtains whenever it slowed near their driveway. She had fined families over flower pots, mailbox numbers, basketball hoops, and holiday decorations that stayed up one day too long. Everyone complained. Behind closed doors, nobody challenged her in public. Linda smiled while pointing toward my workbench, and one inspector immediately began opening drawers that had absolutely nothing to do with community regulations. My pulse climbed, but I never reached for my truck keys. I never called my attorney. I never dialed the police. Instead, I watched another camera angle appear on my phone, then another, then another. Every movement, every conversation, every photograph, every second stamped with the exact time and automatically uploaded somewhere they could never erase. Months earlier, after one too many strange inspection notices, I'd quietly upgraded every camera, every sensor, every backup battery, and every cloud recording account in that garage. Nobody in the neighborhood knew. Linda certainly didn't. She kept pointing, they kept opening things that were never theirs to touch, and the evidence kept stacking itself one quiet frame at a time. They believed they were collecting proof against me. They had no idea they were building the strongest case I could have ever asked for. Ethan Carter was the kind of man most people overlooked because I looked exactly like the guy you would expect to spend his Saturdays fixing an old car instead of looking for trouble. I had lived in Willow Creek Estates for almost 4 years, and until Linda Whitmore decided the neighborhood belonged to her personally, my biggest concern had been whether I could find enough original parts to finish my father's Mustang before the next spring car show. I worked as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company about 30 miles outside the subdivision, designing industrial equipment that demanded precision down to fractions of an inch. Spending my weekdays solving mechanical problems had taught me something simple. Every system leaves evidence. Every action creates a trace. Every mistake eventually reveals itself if you are patient enough to look. That lesson followed me home every evening when I stepped into my garage. The smell of motor oil mixed with fresh pine shelves I had built myself. Chrome trim reflected the warm overhead lights. My father's old leather tool belt still hung on. The same hook where I had placed it after cleaning out his workshop 3 years earlier. Sometimes I would stop working for a minute just to run my hand across the Mustang's faded steering wheel, remembering the sound of his laugh whenever we spent weekends replacing brake lines or rebuilding carburetors together. That garage was never just a place to store tools. It was the only room in my house where every object carried a memory. Linda never saw any of that. To her, every home was another file waiting for another violation notice. She drove through the neighborhood almost every afternoon in her spotless white sport utility vehicle, slowing down just enough to inspect fences, landscaping, driveways, and anything else she believed affected property values. She had a habit of smiling while handing people official envelopes, almost as if she enjoyed watching neighbors open them. One family received a warning because their basketball hoop stayed out after sunset. Another was threatened with daily fines over a vegetable planter that supposedly disrupted community appearance. An elderly veteran across the street was ordered to repaint his mailbox because the shade of black was not listed in the community guidelines. Nobody liked her methods, but most people quietly paid the fines because hiring attorneys cost more than arguing with the homeowners association. I understood why they gave in. Fighting paperwork feels exhausting when you have jobs, families, and mortgages demanding your attention. That was exactly what Linda counted on. During my first year in the neighborhood, she barely noticed me. Then she learned I preferred reading the governing documents before signing anything, and suddenly inspection notices began arriving every few weeks. First it was my workbench being visible through an open garage door. Then it was storage shelves that supposedly looked too industrial. After that came complaints about automotive fluids, even though every container sat inside approved safety cabinets. Each accusation disappeared the moment I responded with photographs, receipts, and the actual wording from the association rules. Linda never admitted she was wrong. She simply moved on to another complaint, convinced that eventually she would find something she could use against me. Looking back while I watched those camera feeds from my phone, I finally understood that none of those earlier inspections had ever been about rules. They had been rehearsals for the moment she believed nobody was watching her instead. While I watched the live camera feeds, another realization settled over me with uncomfortable clarity. Linda Whitmore had not come to inspect my garage. She had come expecting to find something she could turn into leverage. I recognized that look because I had seen it before during every conversation we had ever shared. She never asked questions because she wanted answers. She asked them because she expected people to become nervous. The first time she knocked on my front door, she spent nearly 10 minutes looking past me instead of speaking directly to me, studying the hallway, the living room, even the staircase as though she believed every homeowner was hiding a violation somewhere inside. When she realized I politely answered every question without volunteering anything extra, her smile became noticeably thinner. After that, our interactions followed the same pattern every few months. An inspection notice would appear in my mailbox. I would review the community rules, gather photographs, organize receipts, and respond with clear documentation showing that everything on my property complied with the governing documents. She would never apologize. Instead, another complaint would appear a few weeks later about something completely different. It reached a point where several neighbors quietly joked that Linda spent more time studying our driveways than enjoying her own home. The joke stopped being funny once people started paying fines simply to make the letters stop arriving. One afternoon, my next-door neighbor, Mark Reynolds, admitted he had spent nearly $800 replacing perfectly good landscaping because Linda insisted it no longer matched community standards. Another family removed a children's play structure after receiving repeated warnings, even though similar equipment remained in several other backyards untouched. The rules seemed to change depending on who Linda decided to focus on that month. I noticed a pattern that many people overlooked. She rarely challenged homeowners who immediately questioned her authority with documentation. Instead, she concentrated on residents who were too busy, too exhausted, or too intimidated to push back. That realization changed the way I approached every future interaction. I stopped treating her notices like personal attacks and started treating them like engineering problems. Every letter went into a labeled folder. Every conversation received a written follow-up. Every photograph was stored with the date, time, and location. I even created digital backups because experience had taught me that records become priceless when memories begin to conflict. That habit eventually expanded into my home security system. The cameras were not installed because I expected a dramatic confrontation. They were installed because facts are always stronger than opinions. As I continued watching my garage from my phone, I noticed one of the inspectors pointing toward a cabinet where I stored restoration manuals and maintenance records for the Mustang. Linda nodded before opening the cabinet herself. She flipped through folders that had absolutely nothing to do with exterior property standards, occasionally pausing so another inspector could photograph individual pages. None of them looked concerned. None of them acted uncertain. Their confidence suggested this was not the first time they had crossed a line inside someone's home. They moved comfortably, almost casually, believing nobody would ever question what happened behind a closed garage door. What they could not see was the small notification appearing at the top of my screen each time another recording finished uploading to secure cloud storage. Every minute they remained inside made the timeline clearer, the evidence stronger, and the difference between a routine inspection and an unauthorized search impossible to explain away later. For the next several minutes, I did absolutely nothing except watch. Every instinct told me to drive home, throw open the garage door, and demand an explanation. But years of solving complex mechanical failures had taught me that the first reaction is rarely the smartest one. Machines reveal the truth when you let them finish their cycle. People often do the same thing. I pulled my truck into an empty parking lot outside a small hardware store less than 5 miles away and turned off the engine. The only sound inside the cab was the quiet air conditioner and the occasional notification from my security system confirming another video file had been successfully saved. I enlarged one camera view after another. Linda walked with complete confidence, occasionally pointing toward shelves while the two inspectors followed her instructions without hesitation. One of them measured the distance between my storage cabinets and the wall with a tape measure. The other photographed labels on sealed containers that held nothing more than approved automotive fluids purchased from a local parts store. Then something changed. Linda stopped in front of the Mustang and slowly ran her eyes across the unfinished restoration project before looking toward the filing cabinet beside my workbench. She pulled open the top drawer and began flipping through folders marked insurance, registration, restoration receipts, and family records. My jaw tightened because those documents had absolutely nothing to do with neighborhood maintenance standards. She paused on one folder longer than the others, held up a sheet of paper, and said something that the overhead microphone captured clearly enough for me to hear. "Keep a copy of this one. We might need it later." One inspector took a photograph before placing the document back into the folder as though handling someone else's personal records was perfectly routine. That single sentence changed everything. Until that moment, someone could have argued they misunderstood the limits of an inspection. Now their own conversation showed intent that reached far beyond checking community compliance. I quietly opened another application on my phone and verified that every camera remained connected. Green status lights appeared beside each device. The cloud backup displayed complete. Synchronization. The audio recordings were processing normally. Months earlier, I had even enabled redundant storage because I believed important evidence should never exist in only one place. Looking back, that decision became one of the smartest investments I had ever made. As I continued watching, I noticed something else that Linda never bothered to consider. Every time she moved through the garage, she naturally positioned herself beneath one camera before walking directly into the field of view of another. There were no blind spots. Every expression, every gesture, every conversation flowed together like pieces of a carefully assembled timeline. She believed she was operating in private simply because the homeowner was not physically standing there. She never imagined the homeowner was quietly observing every second from a phone resting in his hand. I leaned back in my seat, took one slow breath, and resisted the temptation to interrupt them. The longer they stayed, the less room they would have later to claim confusion, misunderstanding, or innocent mistakes. They thought they were gathering information about me. In reality, they were documenting their own decisions with remarkable precision, 1 minute at a time. By the time they had been inside my garage for nearly 20 minutes, I realized something almost unsettling. Nobody was acting like they expected to be questioned later. There was no hesitation before opening another cabinet, no discussion about whether they should ask permission, and no concern about leaving fingerprints on drawer handles or moving personal belongings out of place. Confidence like that does not appear overnight. It comes from believing there will never be consequences. I watched Linda stop in front of my workbench where a yellow legal pad rested beside an open service manual for the Mustang suspension. She casually flipped through several handwritten pages filled with torque specifications, parts numbers, and maintenance notes my father had scribbled years ago. Those pages had no financial value, but they carried memories that could never be replaced. She looked at them for only a few seconds before setting them aside with complete indifference. Then she pointed toward a locked steel cabinet in the corner. One of the inspectors tried the handle, discovered it was locked, shrugged, and moved on without saying a word. That tiny moment told me more than anything else had so far. They clearly expected to access whatever they wanted. The only reason they stopped was because they physically could not open it. The overhead microphone continued capturing every conversation with remarkable clarity. They discussed storage shelves, paint cans, and electrical outlets before drifting into casual speculation about whether I might be operating a business from home because I own professional-grade tools. Another inspector laughed and commented that homeowners always claimed everything was a hobby. Linda responded in a calm voice that documentation usually revealed more than people intended. Listening to that exchange, I finally understood why she had spent so much time digging through folders. She was not inspecting property conditions anymore. She was searching for information that could support future accusations. Whether those accusations proved accurate almost seemed irrelevant. The process itself created pressure, and pressure often convinced people to surrender before the facts ever mattered. My phone displayed another notification confirming that every recording had already been duplicated to an off-site server. I quietly opened the event log and reviewed the sequence. Motion detection activated at exactly 9:14 that morning. The side entry sensor recorded the first opening 1 second later. Every camera remained synchronized to the same network clock, creating a seamless timeline that could not easily be challenged. Months earlier, setting up those systems had felt excessive. Now it felt almost prophetic. I considered calling a friend who lived nearby and asking him to walk over simply as a witness, but I stopped myself. An unexpected interruption could end the recording before the full story unfolded. Patience had already brought me this far. There was no reason to abandon it now. As if determined to remove every remaining doubt, Linda stepped toward the large whiteboard. Mounted above my workbench where I kept restoration schedules and personal reminders. She carefully photographed every section before instructing one inspector to capture wider angles of the entire garage. They were creating their own record without realizing mine was infinitely more complete. Every photograph they took was matched by several high-definition cameras quietly preserving the context surrounding it. They believed a collection of still images would allow them to shape whatever narrative they wanted later. They never imagined that a continuous recording with synchronized audio was documenting every choice they made, every object they touched, and every unnecessary step they took beyond the limits of any reasonable inspection. Almost 30 minutes had passed, and I still had not started my truck. The morning sun reflected across the windshield while the security feeds continued playing silently in my hands, each passing second adding another layer to a story that no one would be able to rewrite later. I finally understood why experienced investigators often tell people not to interrupt someone who believes they are getting away with something. The longer confidence goes unchallenged, the more revealing it becomes. Linda had completely relaxed. She no longer glanced toward the garage door or checked the time. She acted like she owned the space, casually walking from shelf to shelf while assigning small tasks to the two inspectors. One measured storage racks. Another photographed electrical outlets. Linda continued opening drawers that had nothing to do with community appearance or maintenance standards. She even paused to examine a small wooden box sitting beside the Mustang. Inside were old spark plugs, faded photographs, and a rusted pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. She lifted the lid, looked inside for only a moment, then closed it again with obvious disappointment, as though she had expected to discover something more useful. That single gesture said everything. She was no longer searching for violations. She was searching for leverage. I quietly zoomed in on another camera angle and noticed one of the inspectors pull out his own phone instead of using the official inspection camera hanging around his neck. He snapped several pictures before slipping the device back into his pocket without saying a word. The cloud recording captured the entire sequence from 2 different directions. Every movement carried a precise time stamped down to the second. There would never be an argument about what happened first or who touched what. The evidence existed independently of memory. As an engineer, I trusted systems that removed opinion from the equation, and that was exactly what I was watching unfold. Facts do not become stronger because someone speaks louder. They become stronger because they remain consistent no matter who reviews them. I opened the remote settings for my security system and confirmed that every recording had already been mirrored to a second encrypted account outside my home network. Even if every camera somehow disappeared, the files would remain untouched. Months earlier, setting up redundant backups had seemed almost excessive. Sitting there in that parking lot, It felt like the most valuable decision I had ever made. My phone battery had dropped below 50%, so I connected a charging cable and kept watching. I wanted the complete story, not just the dramatic parts. That was when Linda stopped in front of the side entrance leading into the house itself. She rested her hand on the doorknob for a brief moment before trying it. Locked. She frowned, looked at one of the inspectors, and quietly said, "Maybe next time." The words were soft, but the ceiling microphone captured them perfectly. A chill ran across my shoulders despite the warm Texas morning. Until then, I had believed they intended to stay inside the garage. Hearing those 3 words made me realize this visit might only have been the beginning of something much larger. Instead of feeling angry, I felt remarkably calm. Every careless decision they made was narrowing their options later. They believed they were creating pressure that would eventually force me to surrender. They never imagined they were constructing a complete timeline that would allow the truth to speak entirely on its own. The decision I finally made surprised even me. I started my truck, but I did not race home with tires squealing or anger clouding my judgment. Instead, I drove at exactly the speed limit, giving them every opportunity to finish whatever they believed they were accomplishing. By the time I turned onto Willow Creek Drive, the live feed showed Linda gathering the inspectors near the garage door as though they were wrapping up another routine visit. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did on a quiet weekday morning. Sprinklers clicked across neatly trimmed lawns. A delivery van rolled past without slowing down. An elderly couple walked their golden retriever along the sidewalk, completely unaware that a story capable of changing the entire community was unfolding less than 100 yards away. I parked across the street instead of pulling into my driveway. From that angle, I could still watch the live camera feeds while seeing my own house with my eyes. The timing had to be right. I waited until Linda reached for the side exit, then crossed the street at an unhurried pace. My footsteps echoed softly across the concrete driveway, but nobody inside noticed because they were still talking among themselves. The garage door remained partially open exactly as it had been when they entered. I stepped beneath it, and all 3 of them turned at nearly the same moment. The expressions on their faces shifted from confidence to surprise so quickly that it almost looked rehearsed. Linda recovered first and forced a polite smile. "Good morning, Ethan. We were just completing a neighborhood inspection." I looked around my garage before meeting her eyes. My workbench drawers were not fully closed. Several folders rested on top of the filing cabinet instead of inside it. The wooden memory box beside the Mustang had been moved a few inches from where I always kept it. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet every small detail quietly confirmed everything I had watched from my phone. I smiled just as calmly as she had. "Please do not stop on my account," I said. "I would hate for anyone to miss the end of the inspection." The 2 inspectors exchanged uncertain glances. Linda tilted her head slightly, studying my face as though trying to determine whether I knew something she did not. "We have already finished," she replied. I nodded toward one of the ceiling cameras. "That is unfortunate." The recording was becoming very informative. For the first time that morning, complete silence settled inside the garage. One inspector instinctively looked upward. Then the other followed his gaze. Linda remained perfectly still, but I noticed the confidence disappear from her expression. I reached into my pocket, unlocked my phone, and turned the screen toward them. 3 synchronized camera views continued playing in real time, complete with audio waveforms and precise timestamps running beneath each image. Nobody spoke. Nobody argued. They simply watched themselves standing exactly where they were, realizing every conversation, every drawer, every photograph, and every unnecessary decision had been preserved from beginning to end. I never raised my voice. I never accused anyone of anything. There was no need. The cameras had already done all the talking, and judging by the silence filling my father's garage, everyone there understood that the story now belonged to the evidence rather than the people trying to explain it. None of us said another word until they quietly walked out of my garage. Linda managed a brief nod before stepping onto the driveway, but the confidence that had followed her through the neighborhood for years had been replaced by careful silence. She knew as well as I did that there was no benefit in arguing with a recording that captured every second from multiple angles. I waited until their sport utility vehicle disappeared around the corner before locking the garage, making fresh backup copies of every video file, and placing the original recordings into secure, encrypted storage. Then I did something Linda probably expected me to avoid. I followed the proper process. I called my attorney first. Instead of giving an emotional version of what happened, I sent him a complete timeline that included synchronized video, audio, motion sensor logs, cloud verification records, and still images showing exactly when each drawer had been opened and each cabinet had been searched. Less than an hour later, he called back with only one question. Did you edit any of these files? I answered honestly. Not a single frame. His response was immediate. Good. Do not touch them. We are preserving everything exactly as it exists. By the following afternoon, formal preservation notices had been delivered to the Homeowners Association, requesting that all inspection reports, internal communications, visitor logs, and camera footage from the association office be retained. My attorney explained that once an organization receives notice that evidence may become part of a legal dispute, destroying or altering records can create even greater problems than the original incident. Suddenly, the situation was no longer about one unexpected visit inside my garage. It had become a matter of documented procedures, authority, and accountability. News traveled through Willow Creek Estates faster than I expected. Mark Reynolds knocked on my front door, carrying a folder filled with old warning letters he had never challenged. The elderly veteran from across the street brought copies of photographs he had taken after receiving repeated notices about his mailbox. A young couple arrived with inspection forms that listed violations which mysteriously disappeared after they paid several $100s in fines. None of them knew exactly what had happened inside my garage, but they all sensed something had changed. For the first time, people believed someone had evidence instead of another story. The Homeowners Association announced a special board meeting for the following week to address what they described as concerns regarding inspection procedures. That phrase alone made me smile, because it sounded remarkably different from the confident language Linda had always used in her warning letters. On the evening of the meeting, the community clubhouse filled more quickly than I had ever seen before. Every chair was occupied, and neighbors stood quietly along the back wall waiting to hear what would happen. Linda sat beside the other board members with a stack of neatly organized papers, avoiding eye contact with almost everyone who entered the room. My attorney connected a laptop to the large television mounted at the front of the clubhouse and calmly explained that the recordings would be presented exactly as captured, without edits, enhancements, or interruptions. Then the first camera angle appeared on the screen. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system. Nobody needed dramatic speeches or emotional accusations anymore. Every timestamp, every conversation, every open drawer, and every unnecessary decision spoke with a clarity that no explanation could erase. And as the first few minutes played across that screen, I realized the truth had finally reached the only audience that truly mattered. The final video ended without dramatic music, raised voices, or emotional speeches. It simply stopped on a frame showing Linda standing in the middle of my garage, while the timestamp continued counting upward in the corner of the screen. For several long seconds, nobody inside the clubhouse moved. Board members looked at one another instead of at the audience. Neighbors who had spent years quietly accepting inspection notices sat with folded arms, waiting to see whether the same rules that had always been applied to homeowners would finally be applied to the people enforcing them. My attorney closed the laptop and calmly placed a printed timeline on the conference table. Every camera angle matched the motion sensor logs. Every conversation matched the audio recordings. Every image matched the cloud archive. There was nothing left to debate because the evidence did not depend on memory or opinion. It depended on facts that remained exactly the same each time they were reviewed. After a brief private discussion, the board president announced that Linda Whitmore would be removed from all inspection responsibilities pending an independent review of association practices. The two inspectors were also relieved of field duties while the association examined how inspections had been conducted throughout the community. Every outstanding violation issued against my property during the previous year would be withdrawn and reviewed individually. More importantly, the board voted to suspend interior inspection practices entirely until new written policies could be created with legal guidance and homeowner approval. Around the room, I saw neighbors exchanging quiet looks of relief rather than celebration. Nobody applauded because everyone understood the real victory was not embarrassing another person. The victory was restoring boundaries that should never have been ignored in the first place. During the weeks that followed, several homeowners successfully challenged old fines using their own photographs, letters, and documentation. Mark Reynolds recovered money he had spent replacing landscaping that never violated the governing documents. The veteran across the street received a formal written apology regarding repeated notices about his mailbox. Other residents began attending association meetings for the first time instead of assuming their voices would not matter. As for me, I returned to the place where this entire story had begun. One Saturday morning, I rolled open the garage door, turned on the old radio my father used while working on the Mustang, and picked up the same wrench that had been waiting on my workbench before everything changed. The familiar scent of motor oil and polished steel filled the room again. Sunlight reflected across the Mustang's chrome trim exactly the way it always had. Nothing about the garage looked extraordinary to anyone passing by, yet it felt completely different to me because it once again represented what it had always been meant to represent. A private place built on hard work, family memories, and the simple expectation that ownership still meant something. I left every camera exactly where it was. Not because I expected another confrontation, but because experience had taught me that protecting the truth is never a wasted effort. Sometimes justice does not arrive through shouting, revenge, or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives quietly through patience, preparation, and a record that cannot be rewritten. Linda believed nobody would ever question what happened behind my garage door. In the end, that same garage became the one place where every choice was remembered exactly as it happened, proving that the strongest answer to misplaced authority is not anger. It is undeniable evidence preserved one honest second at a time.